capital moves from Rome to Constantinople, right? Okay. By the 4th century, so in the 300s, by the 4th century, you have the establishment of an organized church in Europe. Well, that also transitions to the East and the Byzantines. Also, and if any of you guys need to get up and leave at some point, that's fine. Don't even have to ask, okay? By the 4th century, you had an organized church in the West, but that also transcends to the East. But then, remember, 476, you had the collapse of Rome. Remember that the Byzantines, after the collapse of Rome in the East, they're doing just fine. And they last for another 1,000 years of history. Okay? So there's a great deal of stability in the East as opposed to what's taking place in the West. That follows a period of chaos in the West, and by the time you get to the 6th century, you start to see the emergence of organization again in Western Europe. And that begins with the rise of the Pope, or the Bishop of Rome, right? By the 6th century, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, had become the temporal leader of the Christian community. But that's in the West, not in the East. In the East, they still look towards the Patriarch of Constantinople, and they're doing just fine in the East, right? Doing just fine in the Byzantine Empire. 6th century, by the time we get to the 8th and 9th century, you get the rise of the Carolingian Empire and Charles the Great, right? Charlemagne, Charles the Great. In 800, or at the very beginning of the 9th century, remember that Charles the Great is coronated as Emperor of the Romans. Once he's coronated as Emperor of the Romans, you have that merging or that fusion of the church, the legacy of Rome, and those Germanic kingdoms. And you have this new European civilization that has emerged at that point. If we look at the Byzantines between the 6th and 8th to 9th century, that's the high point for the Byzantines. It's not until the 10th century that they start to decline. So by the time you get to Charles the Great in the West, you're at the zenith of Byzantine history. All the fruits and so on of Justinian and everything have put the Byzantines in that point in history. By the time you get to the 10th and 11th century, you have the popes of Europe asserting their control, attempting to assert the control and power over Europe. That coincides with the Crusades, okay? And at that point, we are in a downturn in the Byzantine Empire because that also coincides with the rise of who in the East that really challenged the Byzantines? Yes, sir?
The Turks.
The Seljuk Turks, right? And then if we move forward and get to the High Middle Ages and finally the Renaissance, which is 1350 to 1550, there's a lot going on there we haven't talked about yet, like Christopher Columbus, but we have ventured over to the east, and in 1453, remember that not the Seljuk Turks, but the Ottoman Turks put an end to the Byzantine Empire. Okay? Now, in that chart I gave you, there's something that's very important that takes place that I haven't listed. Can anyone tell me what it is? Takes place in the 11th century. Yes, sir?
First Crusade.
Well,
Crusades in general.
yeah, not what I'm looking for though, but you are correct. Crusades, that's part of this moment. But what takes place here in 1054? Remember? 1054.
The church split?
Yeah, the official split between the Eastern and Western Church. In 1054, as the Pope is asserting his control and his authority over the West, he attempts to do that into the East as well. The Patriarch of Constantinople refuses to accept his authority. The Pope excommunicates the Patriarch, and then the patriarch excommunicates the pope. And you had an official split between the Eastern and Roman Empire. Okay? So as we look at that, what was taking place in the East and West, let's quickly go through a few things in the Byzantine Empire. Remember again, Byzantine history begins in 330 when the capital was moved from Rome to Constantinople by Constantine. Remember that the Byzantines had 1,000 years of success in Europe. That success was due to their actual defense of their city, 13 miles of walls to protect their city. They had excellent military forces and commanders. They were very skillful in their diplomacy in the region, and they always had a strong sense of unity and identity, which at times is divided, which is one of the things that causes their downfall. Really, though, their dominance in the region begins with Justinian. He's the most important and most significant of the Byzantine emperors. Remember, he has a very unique story with his wife Theodora. She was an actress, she was a prostitute. They had to change the laws of the Byzantine Empire in order for them to get married, but she emerges as a key figure in the rule of the Byzantines and convinces Justinian to stay and fight during the Nika riots and organize the empire. Well, in the Nika riots, Constantinople burns. He is able to rebuild it in the image that he chooses, and you get this beautification of Constantinople. And beginning there with his building projects, Constantinople emerges as a cultural center of the Mediterranean. And I gave you some of his building projects: the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom, considered the masterpiece of Byzantine architecture; the Hippodrome, a large stadium for chariot races, gladiator fights, and so on, that housed as many as 60,000 spectators. He built roads, bridges, public baths, courthouses, hospitals, churches, and Constantinople again became the cultural center of the Mediterranean world. That stuff costs money though, right? And isn't that one of the historic criticisms of Justinian, that eventually his building projects bankrupts the Byzantine Empire? And I gave you some images there of some of his great works. A Minecraft image. Yeah. Really wasn't. If you're in first period, because I don't remember if I told first period the truth or not.
You told us the truth.
Okay. Justinian's greatest gift to history, though, is his code of law, his body of civil law. Again, his most famous or most important contribution to Western civilization. Why is it so important? Because his code of law really would have an influence on the legal system of Europe and the West for the future. And an example of that was a focus on legal opinions and legal education. So legal opinions, when we think of common law in England, it's based on prior rulings and legal opinions. We think of our own legal system in the United States today, it's based off of prior rulings and legal opinions. And so with Justinian's law code, you can see how that would have an influence later in history. Also a focus on a legal education, law school, attorneys, lawyers. Those were all a key focus of his legal system. And again, that would have an influence on Western history. When we look at the collapse or the signs of problems for the Byzantine Empire, as we're approaching the 7th and 8th century, I would say the most important thing there that causes, trouble for the Byzantines is probably the rise of Islam. Because once we get to the 7th and 8th century, you get the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasids, and so on, and they are challenging the Byzantines for physical property, but then also with culture, technology, and most importantly, religion, right? And we all know that once we get to the Abbasids in the golden age of Islam, when we look at that region of the world, perhaps in the entire world, the Abbasids were the most advanced of their day, when you look at their technology and so on. And that was a threat to the Byzantines throughout the region. Also, they overextended their territory, some historians would argue. Perhaps Justinian had bankrupted the Byzantine Empire with his building projects. They had bad luck with plagues and disease that hurt a significant portion of their population. And they had internal conflicts like the issue over icons, the use of religious images, perhaps an influence of Islam. Remember that in Islam, it's frowned upon and in some areas outlawed to have any sort of images of Muhammad or scenes, biblical scenes and so on. And on the flip side of that, you look at the Roman Catholic Church, and it's very much part of Roman Catholic tradition. And the Eastern Orthodox Church, at least here at this moment in history, in the 7th and 8th century, had a conflict. Are we using images, not to use images, using images, and so on? And it disrupted that sense of unity of the Byzantine Empire and would have an impact on their decline. They also lost territory to the Slavs, the Bulgars, the Seljuk Turks, and then obviously later the Ottomans. Another key event that we mentioned over here of the Byzantine Empire was the Great Schism of 1054. It's the official split of the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's not something that happened overnight. You would say that it began as early as 330 when the capital was moved to Constantinople. You had a growing divide. And there were a lot of things that add to that divide. Even language, Latin versus Greek, okay? Germanic dynasties like Charles the Great versus Macedonian or Greek dynasties in the Byzantine Empire. Issues over the use of religious images. And then finally, the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. And that official split that emerged in 1054. Okay? In the 13th century, the Byzantines had a new threat in their region. The Ottoman Turks, by the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks, a new Turkic group in Asia Minor, had consolidated power and expanded throughout Asia Minor, North Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And in 1453, they did what, throughout history, other nations, civilizations, and armies were unable to do. They were able to sack and destroy Constantinople and put an end to the Byzantine Empire. Remember, it's the Ottoman Turks that destroyed Constantinople. And what key technology did they use to do it? Cannons, gunpowder technology, right? And the Ottomans throughout history, World War I and so on, will always be known for their gunpowder technology. They used artillery in World War I cannons to defeat the Byzantines. Okay, let's look at the Black Death. Any questions about the Byzantines? We're good. So I said one of the topics was culture and society in the High Middle Ages. Definitely the bubonic plague or Black Death could be used as evidence there. But look, I am not, if you choose that topic and you have it tomorrow, I am not looking for an entire essay over the Black Death. Okay? It's just one of the many pieces of evidence you can use. Okay? But it is something you can use because it did have an obvious effect on society in Europe. At least 50% of the society, right? So some key images with the bubonic plague. Remember the plague doctor and what goes into that imagery, the beak mask. Again, why is the plague doctor so important? Because it shows how little or how ignorant the Europeans were dealing with medical technologies, right? When they thought the plague was spread through smell, the smell of death. So they stuffed their beaks with herbs and flowers and so on. Remember that it was spread via fleas on rats, initially in Mongolia, then to East Asia, wiped out as much as 25% of the population of China, spread in grain shipments to port cities in Europe, and wiped out almost 50% of the European population, about 40 million people, 38 million to be exact, when there were only about 75 million people living in Europe. And then the imagery of dancing skeletons. Remember, that's part of the artwork that you see in the Middle Ages. Depending on the dates that we're talking about, that will either be symbolic of the bubonic plague or witchcraft. And we'll get to witchcraft in a few weeks. Okay? Remember why it's called the Black Death, right? The key years in Europe for the Black Death was 1347 to 1351. It's the greatest natural disaster in European history. As I just mentioned, it started in Mongolia, killed 40 million people in China. In some provinces in China, that was as much as 90% of the population. In Europe, 38 million between 1347 and 1351, which is about 50% of the European population. The spread of the disease, why was it spread so easily throughout East Asia and Europe? Well, when you look at those areas, number one, they were dominated by port cities. Number two, it was areas that had seen a great deal of urbanization. People moving to cities, living in close proximity to one another. And at least in Europe, with some very bad conditions when you look at sanitation, right? Where streets were littered with human and animal waste. People had fleas and body lice. Personal hygiene was not a key characteristic of European society. And with the overcrowded conditions, the narrow streets and so on, it was an area that was very ripe for the spread of the bubonic plague, rats, and so on. Okay? So again, it happened in China, it happened in Europe. Other cities were touched by the plague, Baghdad, cities in Egypt, throughout the Middle East, but why didn't it spread so significantly in those cities and not Europe and China? Spread so significantly in Europe and China and not so much in those other cities. And I can't answer exactly why that is. I can tell you that Baghdad was not a port city, okay? It would be a hub for land trade, and we know that the plague spread to Europe through grain shipments to those port cities. Also, we know that the Abbasids put a great deal of focus on what? Cleanliness, right? And remember the document we read where they even focused on, or even had oversight in their markets, the way their food was stored and everything, which, again, the Abbasids, the most advanced civilization at that time, and that would explain a lot of that, okay? As far as the reactions, people blame themselves, and it was always religious in nature. Maybe my faith was not strong enough, or we as a civilization were weakened in our faith. They punished themselves in the streets, beating and whipping each other, or whipping themselves, or they lashed out and blamed other communities, smaller minority groups that were easy to scapegoat. And the big one there was the Jewish communities. As again, like in the Crusades, once we get to the bubonic plague, we get some very significant events of anti-Semitism. Probably the most famous, again, was Strasbourg, Germany, where over 1,000 Jews were burned to death in 1349 due to the impact of the plague. I'm not going to go over all these, but the cures for the Black Death, and I gave you some really crazy cures like drinking your own urine and placing a hen by the swelling. Well, again, what does that show us about science and technology in Europe? It just wasn't advanced, right? It was not advanced. When we look at the impact of the plague, well, you can look at it on society, okay, where it inspired everything from folk tales to rhymes to songs to images of skeletons, right, in its artwork. But as far as the impact on technology and so on, it would lead to better sanitation and advances in medicine, okay? Remember that Italy was hit the hardest in Europe. The poor were affected the most because of their living conditions. 40 million people in China, 38 million in Europe. European population by 50%, Chinese population by almost a quarter, 25%. Any questions about the bubonic plague and the Black Death? Okay, so we have about 10 minutes from when I was going to stop this. Do you have any questions for me, period? Something you want me to go over? Yes, ma'am?
So like was Constantinople, that was in the Byzantine Empire, or was like the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople?
Constantinople is in the Byzantine Empire. It's today Istanbul, and that's where they moved the capital from Rome to Istanbul. And so Constantinople, initially kind of a city-state like Rome, part of the Roman Empire, would gain an empire throughout all the East.
So it was just like the capital?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's the capital. Anyone else? Any more questions? Anything you want me to go over? Yes, ma'am.
When you say West and East Europe, like where's the cutoff? Or where's the divider?
Well, it's hard to look at a modern map and see that, okay? But let me pull up my Byzantine map again, okay? So, 565, that's the Byzantine Empire. The yellow or golden areas there, I refer to that as more as the West, okay? Beginning with Greece and the Balkan region, that is Byzantium, that would be Eastern Europe. Now, if we extend that into Greater Europe, I would say Eastern Europe was anything east of Germany. Anything east of Germany. The Ukraine area, the Slavic states, Russia, that would all be Eastern Europe. And if you think about the religious divide, that gets a little more complicated because Poland is primarily Roman Catholic. You go just to the east in Russia, and it's going to be Eastern Orthodox. Okay? So around this area is where I would divide that. Okay? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am? I will. Let's see. Let me pull up that slide too. Well, I can just say without pulling up the slide. So Pope Innocent is the 12th and 13th century. Okay? He's during the 12th and 13th century. And remember that Pope Innocent, once you get to the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, the popes are asserting their power and their control in Europe. And the most powerful of those popes was Pope Innocent. Okay? When we look at who had the most authority, was able to influence the political landscape of Europe the most, it would be Pope Innocent. Okay? He's not the only one, but Pope Innocent is one of the most powerful popes in medieval history. Okay? What else? Yes, sir.
Did you ever get a picture of the big cannon that they used to take down Constantinople?
I did. I didn't show it the first or second person. Period. I think this is the only one I showed you guys was the smaller cannons,
Yeah.
which really aren't that small.
Yeah.
But there is the, there's the cannon. And even that picture doesn't do it justice of how long it is. I'll have to read and see exactly how long it was. But they had to, again, put it together there on the battlefield. Anyone else? Anything? Even Germany or the Pope? Okay, I guess we'll stop there.